15. Julia and Dan. The entire surface of the lake was a series of ridges, and the water close to the shore was getting brown. There could be a storm coming, grimaced Dan Moyo as the waves crashed onto the shore. There was hardly a fisherman in sight, even the tourists who had been sunbathing had since retired indoors. Some of the workshop participants were also staring gloomily at the lake, hoping there wasn't going to be a storm, otherwise they would be forced to stay in their rooms or be in the bar. What most of them wanted after a hectic afternoon session which had been dominated by Dr. Moyes again was a quick dive into the lake or a ride on the boats to an islet which was densely populated by colonies of lazy birds. Dr. Moyes had simply worn all of them out with his endless string of questions. "Excuse me? Dr. Moyo," a waiter said, an envelope in his tray. "Yes," Dan nodded. "Mail for you, doctor," the waiter said, raising the tray. "Thank you." The moment Dan got the bulky envelope, his blood froze, for he had recognized the handwriting. What could have prompted Julia to write him a letter? Must be something pretty important. And already there was a nagging question at the back of his mind, a question he didn't want to entertain, but it was a question that could grow and grow, giving him no peace of mind. Had she discovered something about Mlo and Trisha? Possible, he thought, recalling the fact that Tom Nyrenda and the little boy would be arriving in the country that very day, Wednesday. Maybe they had arrived, and Tom had let the cat out of the bag. But when he looked at the stamp, he noticed it had been postmarked 10:05 a.m. So, Tom couldn't have arrived by then. But again, there was another question: suppose he had arrived yesterday on a different flight, maybe via Lusaka or Harare, instead of Nairobi. As if sleepwalking, he went to his room and threw himself on the bed, unable to gather enough stamina to read the contents. He had a feeling that whatever was in the letter was going to spell doom to him. Should he open it or shouldn't he? Shouldn't he just ring Julia and pretend he hadn't received any letter? Dan had never felt so unsure of himself before, except the day he had received a khaki envelope from his headmaster. This was the time when he had just heard rumors that the A-level results were out. He had hesitated before opening the envelope, for he had the feeling that maybe he had got an F in biology, and that would mean his dream of becoming a medical doctor wouldn't materialize. The exam had been tough, particularly the dissection bit. Dissecting a rat wasn't easy, and he had left the room not sure whether or not he had done a good job of it. But when he finally ripped the envelope open, the first thing to catch his eye was biology A. So slowly, very slowly, he started tearing open the envelope, and again with deliberate slowness he unfolded the letter. But when he started reading it, gone was the slowness. He read it hurriedly, not believing what he was reading. With every passing moment, his anger was rising. How could Julie have done that, keeping him in the dark as if he was not part of the family circle? What did she think he was? Minutes later, a frustrated and angry Dan managed to convince the manager of the club that he should use one of the cars on a hire basis. He would pay for every kilometer covered, for, no matter what, he had to be in Blantyre that day. At first the manager was adamant that he was not operating a car hire organization, but when Dan said it was a must that he should be in Blantyre because there was a big marital issue at stake, the manager's attitude changed quickly, for he himself had just been divorced and life wasn't just the same anymore. As the car Dan was in sped towards Blantyre, Julia was reading for the umpteenth time Dan's letter, which had been delivered to her late in the afternoon by a messenger from the hospital. At the time she was stuffing her clothes into a traveler's bag, for she had made up her mind not to stay in the house. If Dan wanted her back, he knew where to find her. His letter of confession just made things worse for her, because she was now convinced that Dan would weigh her against this Trisha girl and come up with the conclusion that Julia was no different from her. So, if she was no different, then he would have no choice but to call for Trisha. After all, his friend Tom definitely knew Trisha's address. The point was, wasn't she the mother to his son? That was a bond which nobody could break. But was Julia a mother to Dan's child? No. She told Alone not to leave the house until the master came back home, even if it meant sleeping in the sitting room, right? Yes, madam, he nodded, surprised that the madam appeared to be leaving for some place in a hurry. He shrugged his shoulders and went back to the kitchen. Julia walked out of the gate to the waiting taxi she had summoned. Kanjedza, she said, pushing the bag into the back seat. Yes, Donna. As the taxi rushed towards Kanjedza, Julia's mind was in total chaos. It was impossible for her to think straight, for once more her future was bleak, just as it had been at the time she had been in Mangura awaiting delivery. She could see her mother now smiling sadly at her, she could see her papa smoking quietly, occasionally stealing glances at her as if to say, "How could you let me down?" She could see her uncle, her aunt, the doctor, the nurses. Ahead of the taxi was an overcrowded bus with a couple of men hanging onto the rails with one hand, the other clutching a loaf of bread. You couldn't help wondering whether such people would agree to pay the full fare if suddenly it started raining and they got soaked. But Julia did not see the bus, neither could she see the people clinging to the rails, their jackets flapping against their backs, for all she could see was her past. She could see her mother rummaging through her school bag looking for little notes from boys, unaware that Julia was standing in the doorway. She could see her mother's angry expression every time Julia came home late with a lame excuse that she had been held up at a friend's place. The taxi finally pulled up outside Sibonjile's house and she paid off the driver, giving him a generous tip. "Thank you, Donna," he said before driving off. And the moment Julia stepped into Sibonjile's house, she broke down. "Go into the bedroom," Sibonjile said to Tendahai, who had been reading a comic while eating a cob of cooked maize. She looked uncertainly at her weeping sister for a moment before going into the bedroom where she switched on her portable radio. "My, what is it, Julia?" Sibonjile asked, leaning over to her sister to pat her gently on the shoulders. It took some time before Julia could pull herself together and give Sibonjile Dan's letter and tell her she had told Dan about the family secret. She stared at her elder sister as she read the letter, and she couldn't help noticing how much Sibo resembled their father. Yes, she had never noticed that, but now as Sibo read the letter, Julia realized that if Sibo had been a man she would have completely taken after their papa, the same slanting forehead, the long and thick eyelashes. After a time, Sibonjile heaved a sigh and handed the letter back to Julia. "I'm glad he's told you the truth," she said. You don't understand, Sibo." "I do." "You don't. Can't you see that once he has this son of his here, he'll call for the Trisha girl?" "What about you?" "Divorce me, he will." "On what grounds, Julia?" "Can't you see I've a child by another man and that I never bothered to tell Dan about it?" "Julia," Sibonjile said sitting back, "I'm older than you and I know what I'm talking about. If between you and Dan there's love, I don't see why you should despair. Okay. You've both told each other the truth and that means you're free to start living again, if you see what I mean. Love will always triumph in the end, won't it?" Julia thought her elder sister was taking everything too lightly. Didn't she see the implications of having Dan's son in the house? He would always remind Dan of his mother, wouldn't he? And what then would stop Dan from getting in touch with her to come to Malawi? And, moreover, why hadn't he told her about the Trisha girl and the child, for she would have understood? Why hadn't he? "Love will always triumph in the end," Sibonjile said again with an encouraging smile. "Let's just wait and see. Everything will be okay." "Taking it too lightly, snorted Julia. "What? What do you know about love? What do you know? Why don't you shut up? Who do you think you are, my personal god? I hate silly advice, let me tell you. Won't listen to you anymore." "Fine." Julia jumped to her feet and stormed to the kitchen where she broke down again. Sibonjile understood that what Julia wanted was to be alone. Julia was always like that, she hadn't changed much. Once angry, she would rush off and cry herself to sleep. There was that time in Mufikos when their mother had accused Julia of having stolen the $2 she had put in a drawer. Julia saw red and shouted at her mother, "I know you hate me. Why don't you disown me and I'll go away?" But mother had insisted that it was Julia who had pinched the money. Later when father had come for lunch he said it was he who had taken the $2 for he had run out of cigarettes. Julia got so angry with her mother that she rushed off to the bedroom and locked herself in. She refused to touch both lunch and supper. Sibongile was dozing in the sitting room although there was loud Commodore's music coming from the neighbor's house when she heard a knock on the door. "Who is it?" she asked, walking to the door. "Dan," came the voice curtly. "Ah." She unlocked the door and flung it open. When Dan stepped into the room, she noticed that his eyes were red and his hair unkempt. "Where's Julie?" he asked, not sitting down. Something in his voice made her hesitate. Was he going to beat Julia up? He sounded so angry. "Where is she?" he demanded, his red eyes on her. "I've to lie to him or else I'll be putting Julia in trouble." But on second thoughts, she said to herself, she was going to tell him where Julia was, but if he dared lift a finger against her, she would smash him with the pots. And after all, her neighbor was quite a muscular fellow who wouldn't hesitate to be of help. Satisfied that the situation was under control, she said, "In the kitchen." Dan strode into the kitchen, kicking the door shut with the back of his heel. Sitting on a chair, her head in her lap, was Julia. He stood looking at her, imagining her smiling at some boy of 18, leading him on. "Julie," he said, but got no response. It was only when he shook her by the shoulder that she looked up, her eyes bloodshot, too. "Why, Julie," he began, breathing rapidly, "why didn't you tell me before?" She didn't answer. They stared at each other for a long, long time, neither of them lowering their eyes. It was Dan who broke the silence, his voice no longer strung up. "All the way from Mango Chi, I've been thinking. When the car dropped me home, I was still thinking, and I realized, thank God, what you must have been through in order to safeguard the family secret. The price must have been high, for you cannot live with such a secret and be at peace with yourself." "Dan." "Sorry," she muttered, still staring at him. "Tell me," he said with a sigh. "Tell me again about this Alphonse man. I suppose he's that bloody ruffian who came to the hospital." Moments later, Julia found herself telling him about the Mufikos days and how she had become infatuated with Alphonse's wizardry at football. She realized that there was no longer bitterness in her heart, only a hollow feeling of nothingness. "You should have told me the first day we met at the cinema. I was afraid I'd lose you, dear," she said, her eyes not leaving his face as if to make sure he wouldn't disappear. "You know how much I love you, Julie." "I know." Then slowly Dan pulled her to her feet and held her close. He thought he could feel her pulse returning to normal. "Dan, why didn't you tell me about your son, Mlo, before you married me?" Julia asked, surprised that she still had courage to ask him a question. And his response as well surprised her. He burst out laughing. "You know why? I didn't want to lose you," he said, squeezing her closer. That answer convinced her that between the two of them there would never be any wall again, that between Dan and her there would never be any obstacle. "Oh, Dan," she sobbed with happiness. Who would believe it that only a few hours ago she had been so unsure of her future? "What are you going to do about Alphonse? If he wants, let him prove in the courts that the child is his. But before you do anything, Julie, I suppose you've to tell Tendehai the whole truth." Slowly Julia detached herself from his arms until she could see his face. "Alphonse is dead," she said, and went on to recount what the cinema manager had told her. "I'm sorry he's dead, Julie, but maybe that's the best that could have happened. You don't have to tell Tendehai then about the family secret until she's of age, only then will she understand." "Yes." And in her mind's eye she could see Alphonse sitting next to her on a bus, wearing his tracksuit and telling her not to miss the coming game, for he was going to score 2 goals for her. "How about Mlo?" Julia suddenly asked, her spirit sinking abruptly as she realized that Dan hadn't told her whether he was prepared to take her back or not. Could it be because of his son? "I should be asking that question, Julie," Dan said, and proceeded to say that as far as he was concerned, he wanted Julia to help him bring up the boy. "He's your son, too," he said. "We'll all live together and look forward to a bright future." "What about his mother?" "She disappeared." "She's gone," Dan answered quickly, perhaps too quickly, but he didn't want to say that he had read in the Sun that a certain Trisha was dead, for he didn't want to believe she was. Not that he still loved her, no, But for the sake of his peace of mind, he would never forgive himself, for he would always think he directly or indirectly sent her to her death because he had ditched her as if she didn't matter in his life. "Someday, dear, tell me more about her," Julia said, sensing that he didn't want to talk about this Jamaican girl who belonged to his past. He didn't want to pick the hoe and dig up the skeleton. Sometime later, well after midnight, Dan and Julia, hand in hand, walked out of the kitchen across the sitting room to the Datsun coupe outside. Sibongile had long since retired to bed, but they did not bother to lock the house nor to tell her they were leaving, for they were in a world of their own, a world without a past. It was about lunchtime the following day when Dr. and Mrs. Moyo called at room number 6, Shire Highlands Hotel. "Come in." They walked in and their eyes fell, almost simultaneously, on the handsome little boy wearing a three-piece suit and a bow tie. For the time being, Tom Nyrenda, standing by the door, his clothes smelling of mothballs, was forgotten. Then Julia went forward and knelt near the little boy, gave him a kiss and a hug before saying, "Say hello to your dad and mum. You like me, don't you?" The boy nodded, his lips pressed together, English style. Epilogue. A year or so later, Dan was best man at the wedding of Tom Nyrenda, Ph.D. Sibongile was the bride. Little Mlo played the role of a page and Tendehai was kept busy ushering drinks to the guests. Julia, a 6-month-old baby strapped to her back, helped sing that Pelakoni song as the guests queued up to offer the bride and groom some money. Among the guests in the hall was Tom Nyrenda's English friend who had arrived in the country 6 or 7 months earlier from London as a VSO volunteer. He was introduced as Jack Bedford.